So just a note that this session is recorded. So if you do wish to remain anonymous, please keep that in mind in your Zoom profile. And welcome everyone to the second session of our annual student conference. We had a brilliant opening and first session earlier on today. And so far the quality of presentations has just been amazing. The second session is about the environmental rights interpreted, and I am Dr. Melanie Murcott. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Pretoria, and I'll be chairing this session alongside Prof. Jim May at Widener University, who's presently a visiting professor at Utah. And over to Jim to introduce our first speaker.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, is the audio okay? Can you hear me okay? Okay, well, welcome, everybody. The whole idea of environmental rights is revolutionary in certain ways. It's recognizing that human beings have worth that's equal across time and space. And with that comes a recognition of certain kinds of rights. Rights to life, to speak, to assembly, and a whole variety of things. So there's a question as to, well, is there a right to the environment? And the Constitution of South Africa that we're celebrating has been a leader in helping to figure out just what that means, just what it means to have environmental rights. And so I'm just so happy to be co-moderating this panel with Dr. Murcott. Thank you very much. So our instructions are just to jump right in and introduce the speakers without the bios. You have the bios available online, everybody. So I have the pleasure of introducing Tafumanei, Chikanya. I hope that wasn't horrible in pronunciation, who is seeking a master's at Luz University in Italy. And his paper topic is Gadamer's philosophical hermeneutics and the politics of environmental governance. Tafumanei, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Malawi, the home of Africa. I hope you are getting me clearly. I'll begin sharing my screen. So my presentation is titled Gadamer's Philosophical Hermeneutics and the Politics of Environmental Governance. It's a little bit away from issues to do with legality. It's something to do with our living experiences and a society's bid to get an understanding or meaning out of what is happening within various communities. So I begin my presentation with a quotation from Habermas. Habermas is a philosopher who said that science and technology become ideology when directed towards social, political objects, but they merely serve in the end to conceal pre-existing, unreflected social interests and pre-scientific decisions. This assertion for me that was made by Habermas, I'm not going to argue against him, but I'm just going to sort of agree with him, especially in the sense that there are so many hidden agendas that are unreflected in so many scientific or technological advancement that is going on, that to such an extent that if people are got carried away by the spontaneity of technology, they so happen to lose what is really behind it. So I used this assertion as a basis on which I argue that current failures in environmental politics are emanating from the emergence of science as a possible paradigm for reaching a consensus at multilateral environmental agreements level. I read the latest IPCC report, and the latest IPCC report on climate change was basically very scientific. And I wouldn't want to argue against that because it's really positive and a lot of people put in that much work. But if you bring it to the ground, if you bring it down to the level of people who are in the village, there isn't not much they can understand, especially from the wording itself and the scientific terms that were used in that. So that which I refer to as the politics of environmental government comes from deep-seated interest that may be capitalistic, concealed in technical or scientific terms that either coerces the poor or coddles the rich. Thus, I argue that the methods and mechanisms of scientific assessments that are used in the development of consensual knowledge at multilateral environmental agreements, for example, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, are fragmented. And of late, civil organizations and communities have begun realizing a lot of ecological irrationality being institutionalized by virtue of using financial or political or military power on others. There was a debate recently on climate finance. People were asking, so who is going to finance all this? Basically, here in Africa, very few countries have a budget that can actually allow them to invest much in technology, especially on carbon control. Furthermore, there seems to be a pervasive reluctance by parties to EMAs to align themselves with parties with non-scientific arguments for or against declarations. Declarations and proclamations are made at that international level. And some African countries or some Asian countries or some other countries in the world that are not really advanced in terms of technology, who are not really invested in terms of technology, and some countries also who are happen not to have a representative in IPCC committees who might have a non-scientific argument against certain declarations, don't really have a voice. So what we have then at MEAs are parties with a deeply established and seemingly immutable and political system that is persistent on maintaining structures that systematically disadvantage the other or advantage the others. I'm sure we are all aware of the North-South dilemma. The North countries being regarded as those that are technologically advanced and the South being us down here. Debate has been going on since the Rio Summit, since 1972. There has been that division, and come to think of it, this is 2021, and we're still talking of that dilemma, of the North-South dilemma. Who pays for this? Who does this? Who is responsible to blame? For global environment agreements to be effective, there is need for historical social agents whose actions are enabled by the social understanding and not those people who are dissociated or displaced from their lived reality because of veto power, economic, or other covert operations. This point is particularly for those of us who are coming from the African perspective. That I've listened to a lot of guys preparing to go for COP26, COP25, and their language is contentious. It's a language of confrontation. It's a language of saying, what are we going to get when we get there? What do we really want? It's not about contention, but it's about us as Africans, us as a people, knowing exactly our social understanding. What is it that we are feeling when it comes to environmental issues? What if you put yourself sort of in a position where you have that lived experience of being in a cyclone, a lived experience of being in a drought? We are more or less someone who is very much effective to be on that arena. Thus, I intend to show that Gadamer's philosophical hermeneutics provides for us an epistemic framework, rules of dialogue, and a mind that is within the world, that is actually historically situated in what is really happening around or within a community that we are living. I also intend to show that the hermeneutical paradigms that Gadamer gives us provides for effective dialogue that ensures that parties to EMAs transcend from their epistemological foundations to other horizons. I'm talking about the methodological formalism of actually looking at science as the best possible, reason for us adopting various climate promulgations at EMAs. What is environmental governance? Environmental governance refers to an institutionalized mechanism that serves the purpose of forming policies and platforms for negotiations, as I mentioned earlier on, that are necessary for responding to various global environmental challenges. As alluded to by Spear and Haas, environmental challenges were globalized for the reason that when governments or communities act unilaterally, it's really a daunting task because environmental issues are transboundary. Everyone is affected. A cyclone in Africa has impact in Europe. A cyclone in Europe has an impact in Africa. It also can be defined as an analysis of global political or economic power relations and structures that are institutionalized in the modern economic world system, but however influencing the ways in which policies or processes that are used, or rather the political system of governing our environment. So given the growth of industrialization back then, around 1972, 1992, all these discussions happening, it was really undeniable that there were common resources that were the receiving end of all the misdemeanors of industrial activity, what we refer to as the tragedy of commons. And the first international conference that provided governance platform was the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development that took place in Stockholm in 1972. And precedingly, the 1992 Rio Earth Summit that took place in Brazil, Earth Summit in Johannesburg, and latest being the COPs from 25, now we're going to COP26. These conferences are places where deliberations are made on environmental issues and parties make submissions to abide by or ratified agreed upon resolutions or declarations. For example, the current NDCs, nationally determined contributions, commitments to reduce global emissions levels. So with such continuity on deliberations and global environmental governance, the continued degradation of the environment and current climate change leaves us concerned with the question on the effectiveness of these treaties. This concern forms the crux of this presentation of essay, for it seeks to understand the reason behind the ineffectiveness of such detailed and well-written pacts failing to mitigate consequences of the ever-increasing mismanagement of the environment. Where do we locate the politics of the environment? Basically, there are three questions that should be taken as central to locating the politics. That is the production of the environmental problems. Why do they occur? The differential effects of environmental problems by a variety of categories, that is class, nationality, race, and gender, and responses to these problems. What should we do? Since the environmental problems affect other aspects of world politics, it becomes clear then why previous and ongoing multilateral effects have not been effective. The scale of damages from climate and environmental change varies with the regions, and the impact across the boundaries that I have mentioned, that be it economic and political, also varies. Furthermore, another question is, does it necessarily mean that the EMAs are ideal in responding to the global environmental problems? My response is, environmental problems are human problems. That's bringing about a very complex dimension in the Anthropocene. That's the era of the human. Response, to some extent, we cannot take away the progress that has been made, but we cannot overlook the fragmentation of international relations as a result of environmental problems, as well as non-compliance and the persistent reluctance by locals to adhere too hard and soft legislation derived from EAs. I, for one, come from a village where the issues of nationally NDCs is being really taken seriously by youths in our region. But these youths are guys who are coming from Harare, guys who are coming from towns who have been exposed. But when they come to the village and talk about the NDCs, people are really confused, like, what are these people talking about? So when we look at the politics, we look at the politics from, if we go back to my opening statement that I quoted from the Gadamer, that there are deep-seated intentions, there are deep-seated economic intentions, political intention, for the reason that environmental problems cut across political, economic, and social issues. One thing that we agree at COP26, when it comes to ratification, to making legislation to the host countries, there has to be sort of a synchronization between that environmental legislative instrument, a political instrument, as well as economic instrument. We are talking of the overlapping effects of environmental legislation on trade, on health, or any other parts and parcel of the governance of a state. The environment itself is actually a political problem. We hear of contested resources. We cannot assume that there's an outright solution because people disagree, one, on the nature of the problem, the seriousness of it, the priority as well compared to other problems. Shall we continue talking about environment instead of talking about development? It's one of the arguments. We talk of development. We want to develop as Africans, but here is the issue of sustainability as well coming from EAs. So earlier on, I mentioned that crisis in environmental governance is perpetuated by the persistence of a space of social economy and social structures that systematically advantage others. So these structural inequalities, more or less now in modern society, they are being perpetuated by creating an epistemic shell of technology. Once you put an epistemic shell of technology, meaning that technology has become our source of knowledge, how do we then incorporate that knowledge that we cannot package in a technical form? So Patterson alluded to Graham's model. The Graham's model talks about a continuous strife of capitalists and those without, and also the concept of a hegemony, that an ideological structure is created around an epistemic show of technology, an epistemic show that guarantees that whatever we write in our reports, and encourage you to do, follow that, because this is what is supposed to be done according to the EMAs. But how does that translate to a knowledge that can be acceptable to an indigenous community that actually knows that, or has an interpretation that if the sun is hot, perhaps someone has crossed through a sacred river. If the sun is hot, perhaps someone has gone wearing their shoes in a sacred hill. Those are some of the explanations, but do we venture into that? So technical rationalism now has become the core of modernity and is then used to subsume many of the other features. So if you look at the APCC report, you will see the capitalistic tendency, the bureaucratic tendency that is actually embedded in the technology. So what are the issues from this discussion? The issue is one, methodological formalism. Hello?
Yeah, hi, this is Jimmy again. If you could just wrap up so that there's ample time for discussion. So maybe one more minute. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So the issues that I raised here, one is the issue of formalizing technology, where there is not a genuine conversation to open up IDK's indigenous knowledges. So Gadamer say a genuine conversation is never that one we intend to conduct, but rather a genuine conversation is one that allows the spontaneity of the human person be in the world and express your beingness in the world, no matter the method. So the foundation of our knowledge cannot be entirely and fully known. That's one other view that Gadamer is giving us. So the fragmented worldview that I have given, for me in this presentation, I'm really arguing it on the structures of knowledge, on the structures of language. And perhaps to conclude, I'll conclude with Gadamer's paradigms of understanding. One, multilateral environment agreements, they depend on dialogue. Not a dialogue of a technology to technology, but a dialogue where all parties get into their dialogue with their predisposed perceptions, principles, or dialogues. So hopes are not supposed to be contentious. They are not supposed to be highly contested with one camp saying, we are going to fight for this. It's a dialogue. It's not a dialogue to dislocate others, but it's a dialogue to fuse our horizons of understanding where we are coming from and where we are going. Because of time, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Tafumanei, and also for keeping to time. We'll have discussion after we continue to work our way through the presentations. I think that's the approach. Dr. Murcott, is that right?
That's right.
Sure, thank you.
All right, so our next speaker is Dr., or rather is doing her doctorate in environmental law. And that is Maricélle Botes. And sorry, I've lost my place. And Maricélle will be speaking to, she's a PhD candidate at CLES at Northwest University, and she will be speaking to the constitutional environmental right and its application to the ecological governance for urban ecosystem services protection. So over to you, Maricélle.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murcott. I appreciate it. Thank you also for the opportunity. So I've already been introduced. Oh, let me just share my screen, sorry. Oh, wait. Okay. Can you guys see my screen? No.
Yes, we can. Yes,
okay.
we can.
Awesome. Thank
you.
you.
Can just switch it to presenter mode, maybe?
Oh, of course. There we go. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so as I've been introduced, I will only go into the brief outline what we'll discuss today. So as you can see on the slides, I'm briefly going to touch on the background of the topic of urban ecosystem services protection and the constitutional environmental right and its application to ecological governance for this purpose. Then I'm going to look at the constitutional environmental right as a pathway for ecosystem services protection in South African cities. And I'll also focus on the South African law perspective and local environmental governance and the role of municipalities briefly. And then for that purpose, I will look at LEG instruments or local environmental governance instruments specifically. I'll only touch on a few due to time constraints. And then also, then I'll conclude. So it won't be a very long discussion, hopefully. Okay, so just jumping into the background, urbanization and population growth, as well as unabated urban development, are symptoms of the Anthropocene and are critically affecting cities and city environments worldwide. And urban areas are faced with severe and persistent challenges such as environmental degradation, overexploitation of natural resources, changing chemical compositions of the atmosphere, pollution, and changes in city climates linked to the climate crisis, which is experienced globally as well as in cities. Human dependence on nature as well as human activities have significantly impaired the earth and resulted in these environmental pressures. And these challenges inhibit the capacity or capability of ecosystems to provide crucial ecosystem services on which all of humanity depend for their health and well-being, and bring us closer to transgressing the planetary boundaries configured by Rockstrom and his colleagues, and reaching the tipping points, which will ultimately lead to the destabilization of ecosystems and cause irreversible environmental change. And due to the detrimental impact of human activities and this rapid environmental change, the protection of ecosystems in cities have become increasingly crucial for the natural environment, ecosystem services protection, ecological sustainability, and the resilience of cities, as well as the health and well-being of humans and other organisms in the ecosystems. Environmental law and the environmental right in our constitution, which is the one we're celebrating, can be seen as a pathway through which such protection may be achieved, as it provides ecological governance instruments to be used by governments in their environmental protection mandates. Based on the above context, this question arises whether the environmental right provides adequate ecological governance measures for the protection of ecosystem services in cities, or might it be too ambitious to assume this position based on the wording of the environmental right? So environmental rights are part and parcel of many countries' constitution, and it also finds relevance, as we know, in the South African perspective, in the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa as part of its Bill of Rights, which includes the provision for a right to an environment not harmful to one's health and well-being, and also for this protection or environmental protection to be realized through reasonable legislative and other measures. And in terms of the South African law framework, environmental protection is a constitutional imperative, and the inclusion of reasonable legislative and other measures formed the way for the NEMA and the CEMAs, and ultimately also the introduction of the instruments that I will discuss later that may be used by government spheres in the realization of their environmental mandates. Local environmental governance and the role of municipalities have resultantly received a lot of attention in the past decade or so, and it is becoming increasingly clear that cities play an important role in environmental protection as they are the tier of government closest to these issues. sorry. The Constitution stipulates that the local government has the task of providing democratic and accountable government to ensure provision of services to communities in a sustainable manner and promote social and economic development. I think we've heard that throughout the day so far. But besides this, they're also encouraged to involve communities and community organizations in the matters of local government. Perhaps most notably in the context of this discussion, the mandate to promote a safe and healthy environment. Local governments are required to attempt to achieve these objectives within their available financial, technical, and institutional capacities. And given the reference to sustainable development as well as economic and social development in the constitutional environmental right, it is necessary to consider the developmental mandates of local government insofar as they affect the environment. And when Section 152 is read alongside the environmental right regarding the objects of local government, it is evident that the object of local government to promote social and economic development is closely intertwined with its object to promote a safe and healthy environment. The Constitution also provides for development and planning mandates in Schedules 4 and 5 of the Constitution that devise the functional areas of legislative competence for different spheres of government. And local government's authority in terms of the environment is often contested and brought into question, as local governments are ascribed the exclusive competence and mandate to legislate regarding specific areas, such as air pollution, building regulations, municipal planning, and so forth. But the environment is not explicitly designated as one of their competencies. And even though the environment and nature conservation is listed as a concurrent competence of national and provincial spheres of government, in terms of Schedules 4 and 5A, it is argued that these are in some instances incidental to the legislative competences of local government. And this is due to the mandate in other legislation, as well as other provisions in the Constitution, that they may legislate on these matters to ensure a safe and healthy environment for their constituents within their jurisdiction. In other words, matters that fall within the legislative competence of national and provincial sphere of government must be assigned to local sphere of government, where it relates to local government or would most effectively be administered locally, and where local government has the capacity to administer it. The Municipal Systems Act also contains a provision to this effect and declares that municipalities have the right to do anything reasonably necessary for or incidental to the effective performance of its duties. In correlation with this section, scholars argue that local government is best positioned to govern and influence the collective governing of natural resources and their uses, as well as urban ecosystems in the area of the municipality, as they are the sphere of government closest to the people. The aforementioned planning and developmental duties of the different spheres of government also give rise to planning legislation such as SPLUMA. And I noted in my research that too often environment and planning is considered to form part of two discrete and separate areas of governance, yet they're so inextricably linked and connected based on the notion of sustainable development. But to achieve all of these developmental and planning duties, as well as the mandates in the environmental right, government departments in different spheres of government, inclusive of local governments, need to work together through cooperative government or governance, and must find ways of integrating the environmental concerns into decision-making processes and planning. So looking at the South African local environmental governance instruments, firstly, I looked at compliance-based instruments, which speak to the legal requirements that national and provincial levels of government sorry, lost my train of thought. Okay, so there's compliance-based instruments which speak to the legal requirements at the national and provincial levels of government that municipalities have to comply with. So these are specific environmental duties, activities or processes for which municipalities might need authorization or permission, reporting, monitoring, and compliance management duties of municipalities. Then, as you can see on the slides, we also have governance-based instruments, which relates to the fact that local government has the autonomy or authority to plan, govern, and regulate their own processes and functions and ensure that the duties are discharged lawfully and responsibly. And they can do this by way of municipal integrated planning by use of an IDP, which is geared towards promoting sustainable development and encompasses an agglomeration of specific environmental management plans as provided for in the different CMAs. aimed at realizing environmental protection among the social and economic interests of development. And then also funding and budgeting play an imperative role in the performance of functions of the municipality, as it determines the capacity of the municipality to perform in terms of the duty in respect of local environmental governance and the protection of ecosystem services in cities. There is also governing-based instruments, such as command and control-based instruments, such as municipal bylaws. And as part of its legislative powers, the local sphere of government has the competence and legislative authority to draft and adopt environmental bylaws. At the heart of these bylaws is the goal to mitigate adverse environmental impacts, which include the degradation of ecosystems. These need to be adequately enforced, however, and perpetrators must be prosecuted for non-compliance. And this illustrates how the judiciary is also becoming the first line of defense and the last resort for the vulnerable against environmental damage. Still on the same slide. We also have incentive-based instruments where municipalities, like other spheres of government and organs of state, have the capability of changing the behavior of their constituents through the introduction of incentives or disincentives, such as rebates or taxes or fees or charges, and so forth. There's also agreement-based instruments, such as environmental management cooperation agreements, which they can conclude with external parties, and also rights and civil-based approaches, which can be used to contribute to the awareness and participation in environmental decisions. And this also highlights one of the Lima principles, which is public participation, which is also very important. Then we get the cross-cutting instruments, which fit into more than one or none of the above categories. And these include, for example, spatially based local environmental governance instruments, such as IDPs, which I've already mentioned, and then SDFs, or spatial development frameworks, and land use schemes. So in terms of the spatial development frameworks, SPLUMA makes provision for these frameworks at all spheres of government. And since the SPLUMA makes provision for the inclusion of environmental pressures and opportunities, as well as the locations of environmental sensitivities, it can be deduced that these frameworks contribute to the protection of the environment and its components. A land use scheme, on the other hand, sets out the appropriate categories of land or land use zoning and regulations in a municipal area. And these land use schemes need to be adopted in such a manner that it will not conflict with any environmental management instruments or legislation. And zoning can be used to effect land use schemes. So zoning also has several benefits, among which is the protection of public health, safety, welfare, and conservation. So several of the CMAs also provide for specific environmental management plans. And these must be included in the IDP of the municipality. And through the innovative use of these management plans, urban municipalities may incorporate such sector plans related to other parts of their environmental mandates into their IDPs. Then we also have information-based and cooperation-based LEG instruments. And cooperation-based instruments are instruments that depend on more than one party's cooperation to be successful. And an ardent example of such instruments is PPPs, or public-private partnerships. Okay, so this brings me to some of the challenges that urban municipalities might experience in the implementation of these instruments. And these relate to limited budgets and funding, lack of integration between plans and policies resulting in fragmentation, and ever-present capacity challenges. Municipal budgets and funding are crucial for the implementation of plans and policies, and as such, insufficient funding or budget allocations may hinder the implementation of the vision of the municipality, including the vision for protecting environmental or ecological services. So in conclusion, the existing legal framework, according to my research, is extensive in terms of the available instruments that have a bearing on the environment or aspects thereof. But unfortunately, many of these legal instruments are underutilized, even though they hold a great potential for environmental protection. Each instrument does come with concomitant challenges that need to be considered by an urban municipality before it's included in the municipality's plan to protect its ecosystem services. And it is important also to note that municipalities cannot only use one such instrument, for example, only command and control, but that these instruments should be used in conjunction with other executive instruments to achieve and realize the protection of ecosystem services. The relative autonomy of local government in South Africa makes it possible for municipalities to select and adopt innovative alternative instruments. And environmental law in the South African context, therefore, seems adequate to assume protection for ecosystem services in cities, even if the environmental right itself does not necessarily provide directly or verbatim for the protection of ecosystem services per se. It's probably framed broadly with legislative intent. And ecosystem services can be included in the NEMA definition of what environment entails. And the realization of the environmental right in terms of environmental protection and ecological governance might, however, fall short in certain instances, as urban environments and ecosystem services are presently severely underprotected. However, this might not be a result of the inadequacy of the law or the framing of the environmental right, but rather be indicative of other issues, such as implementation and capacity of municipalities to enforce the instruments under our law. And that's why I mentioned the challenges of municipalities. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maricélle. You can stop your screen sharing. And that was a great presentation. I see there are already comments for you, one from me, one from Mimosa. So I look forward to hearing more during the discussion.
Thank you. Sorry, I can't seem to. Okay, never mind. Thank you.
Share. Thanks, well done.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was super interesting, and it involves some of the same sort of interpretive questions as the next presentation from Rufaro Chikuruwo. And Rufaro's talk is about ecologically sustainable development. And section 24B3 of the Constitution, in response to Professor Michael Kidd. And Professor Kidd has raised some issues about just how section 24 is drafted, that perhaps it was drafted a bit sloppily in certain areas and it's hard to interpret. So Refaro, the floor is yours.
Greetings, everyone. Am I visible?
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity. As already introduced, my name is Rufaro Chikuruwo. I am an LLB. For the duration of my presentation, I shall be sharing my screen, the slides that I will be relying on. Okay, can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. The title of my presentation, which is still work in progress, it's a paper that I'm still working on. It's titled Ecologically Sustainable Development under Section 24B3 of the Constitution, a response to Kidd. Well, South Africa is a country that is governed by a democratic constitution, the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, for which I shall henceforth refer to as the Constitution. The Constitution also contains a Bill of Rights, which affords everyone in South Africa certain fundamental human rights. A classic example is that of Section 24 of the Constitution, which enshrines an environmental right. Section 24 provides that everyone has the right, A, to an environment that is not harmful to their health and well-being. I'm sorry, I'm trying to move my screen, but I don't know what's happening. maybe I should just, okay. Yes. Section 24 of the Constitution provides that everyone has the right to an environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being, and B, the right to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations through reasonable legislative and other measures that prevent pollution and ecological degradation, promote conservation, and secure ecologically sustainable development and use of natural resources while promoting justifiable economic and social development. Professor Michael Kidd's work on the environment provides a notable account of Section 24. Professor Kidd explores on the environmental right and begins by an explanation on the difference between the anthropocentric and ecocentric approach to the environmental right. He proceeds to explain on the meaning of Section 24 of the Constitution, its relationship with other rights, its application, and how it can be realized. However, relevant to my presentation is Professor Kidd's comment on Section 24b3 of the Constitution in particular. Well, Professor Kidd states that Section 24b3 is more of a directive principle having the character of a second generation right that imposes a constitutional imperative on the state to promote environmental protection through reasonable legislative and other measures that secure ecologically sustainable development and use of natural resources while promoting justifiable economic and social development. Having said this, Professor Kidd states upfront that Section 24b3 expressly provides for the concept of sustainable development. He further notes that the Constitutional Court has, for instance, in cases such as fuel retailers, recognized that Section 24b3 contemplates environmental protection through sustainable development. And according to Professor Kidd, sustainable development requires the integration of environmental, social, and economic concerns whenever development is being contemplated. Specifically, Professor Kidd argues that Section 24b3's express injunction to promote environmental protection through ecologically sustainable development refers to sustainable development's integration principle. Based on this argument, Professor Kidd argues that if ecologically sustainable development requires the integration of environmental, social, and economic considerations, then Section 24b3's reference to while promoting justifiable economic and social development is redundant and a result of clumsy drafting. Professor Kidd, however, notes that if Section 24b3's referral to ecologically sustainable development means something different from the integration of environmental, economic, and social considerations, then there would be no redundancy. He concludes his argument by noting that no commentators have, to the best of his knowledge, dealt with the issue yet. My presentation proceeds from this point of departure and attempts to demonstrate that there is a nuance, or rather a difference, between Section 24b3's referral to ecologically sustainable development and the generally often cited concept of sustainable development. Well, on one hand, sustainable development requires the integration of environmental, social, and economic concerns whenever development is being contemplated. In other words, sustainable development requires that there be a balance between environmental protection and economic and social development. On the other hand, ecologically sustainable development in terms of Section 24b3 requires states to prioritize the continued existence and integrity of Earth's ecological systems whenever issues of development are being contemplated. In other words, ecologically sustainable development would require that social or economic development be pursued to improve the total quality of life of the present and future generations, and in a manner that conserves its natural resources on which life depends. Therefore, instead of sustainable development's integration principle, we could turn to Section 24B3's referral to justifiable economic and social development. I say this because justifiable economic and social development under Section 24 denotes development that gives due reverence to planetary boundaries and a safe functional space for humanity. This means that social and economic development must be pursued within the parameters of ecology. The inclusion of the phrase justifiable economic and social development in this regard into Section 24B3 of the Constitution addresses concerns by some who may argue that ecologically sustainable development as contained within Section 24 negates all other economic and social considerations which are necessary for human survival. In this regard, what Section 24 does is emphasize on social and economic development that prioritizes environmental protection before the growth of economies. In light of this argument, one could ask whether a proper interpretation of Section 24's reference to ecologically sustainable development as opposed to the ordinary sustainable development has the potential to alter the judicial process. While considered from a retrospective analysis, my presentation submits that had courts given ecologically sustainable development its actual meaning, then decisions like BP Southern Africa and fuel retailers could have been different in approach. In the interest of time, I shall consider both BP Southern Africa and the fuel retailers case at the same time. Although both cases involved applications for the construction of filling stations, fuel retailers distinguishes itself as having made it all the way up to the Constitutional Court. In both cases, the courts did not approve the construction of the filling stations as they could potentially cause harm to the environment and economy. The courts based their decisions on sustainable development, which required that environmental protection be balanced with economic and social concerns. As a result, the courts noted that the impact of the filling stations on the protection of the area's natural resources was supposed to be balanced with the economic impact posed by the filling stations. However, approaching environmental protection through the lens of sustainable development could result in environmental interests being balanced away, or rather being subsumed under economic development. Accordingly, had the courts framed their decisions in line with Section 24B3's injunction to consider ecologically sustainable development, they could have realized that the addition of the adjective ecologically to sustainable development places priority on preserving the natural resources of the areas to ecologically sustainable development would then focus on conserving the productivity of the soil, waters, and ecosystems of the surrounding areas by ensuring that filling stations do not cause any negative impact on the natural resources upon which the health and well-being of present and future generations depend on. However, my argument does not seek to invalidate any social is that any social or economic development will have to be justifiable as per se. If social or economic development poses a threat to the environment or causes environmental degradation, it could be considered unjustifiable. In essence, social and economic development can only be promoted when the environment is protected. Similarly, the protection of the environment cannot be attained if social or economic development is pursued at the cost of environmental degradation. The account presented here of ecologically sustainable development and its normative content is by no means thorough. It has interest of this presentation and time. However, in view of these arguments, one could conclude that Section 24B3's inclusion of justifiable economic and social development is not redundant, since ecologically sustainable development does not refer to integration of environmental concerns with social and economic development, but instead refers to development that gives priority to the continued existence and integrity of Earth's ecological systems. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead. So thank you, Refaro. There are a bunch of questions in the chat box, and we can continue the conversation during discussion time, but that was super interesting. Thank you.
And our last speaker in this really brilliant session is Ruth Kruger. And Ruth is going to be speaking to us about the environment. The environment is ours, the socio-economic promise of Section 24 of the Constitution. Ruth completed her LLB at Wits in 2020 and is currently a clerk at the Constitutional Court. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murcott. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I will, let me just share my screen. I hope that it will work. Sorry, can I just confirm that you can see my screen? It should just be a blank blue screen at this moment.
Yes, that's right. Go
Thank you
ahead.
Okay, so to start off, let me just check the time. To start off, I thought that we'd play a little bit of spot the difference. On the one hand, there's me, a sustainability scientist who's now trying to be a lawyer, although as Dr. Murcott said, I only just finished my LLB. So I'm very young in the law. And on the other hand, no, actually, I'm sorry, I can't even finish the sentence. I thought I'd quote off, but there's obviously nothing in the way of similarity between that little lawyer over there and the legal superstar that you see on the right. Murcott is obviously best-selling author, sparked a national discussion on land reform, maybe even settled fundamental changes in patterns of land distribution. Yeah, no comparison here. Although the point that I would like to make is that, well, I think he and I have a similar point to make. Advocate Tongai Torby sought to point out that there is a very close link between property rights and socioeconomic rights. And I would like to suggest that the same is true for environmental rights. On that note, my presentation is called The Environment is Ours, and the socio-economic promise of Section 24 of the Constitution would be the subtitle. So then to kick off, what I would like to discuss are the energy challenges that we face in the context of South Africa and how I think Section 24 of the Constitution can speak to those. In order to investigate that, the study that I did was focused on the case study of Kriel, a small town in Mpumalanga, which is surrounded by mines and power stations, and where it has been, it was measured by Greenpeace, I think it was, that it actually has the second highest level of SO2, sulfur dioxide, in the whole world. So ambient air pollution is just ridiculously high there. And I was looking at that case study and looking at it in the context of Section 24, and that led me to consider the concept of a right to energy and how that might potentially fit in with Section 24. before I get into that in more detail, I just want to say, as a sustainability scientist, I suppose I was always trained to acknowledge my assumptions. And the first of those is that this study assumes that rights are useful legal creatures for the poor and marginalized. That's not an uncontentious point, I know, but it's beyond the scope of the study to go into that. The second assumption that I have is that environmental rights are too little recognized where they're relevant, and that they should, in fact, be better recognized. Very simple point, but I'm hoping that we can make it a little bit more complex. Now, to go into this idea of the right to energy, which is essentially what my study turned on. The right to energy is not one that we have in South Africa currently at all, but it is a concept that is growing both in academia and in activism. There are a couple of organizations like Joint de l'Énergie in France and the UK Climate Coalition that speak specifically about the right to energy. And there are a number of authors as well that have explored the concept. If we look at international and foreign law, there is some limited recognition of a right to energy, both in France and in the UK. And if you look at the Rio +20, the convention that came out of the Rio +20 meeting, there is also some recognition of the environmental right there. In South Africa, it's a lot more limited. We did have, in terms of the now I think repealed Electricity Act of 1987, there was a sort of a recognition of a contractual right to energy, but that falls short definitely of the unconditional right to energy that most activists would now speak about. We also, in the Joseph case, which I'm sure you all know better than I do, we came quite close to providing a right to energy, at least a procedural right to energy in the South African context. So it has limited recognition, but I think it is growing. The content of this right, though, is important. And if we are going to consider a right to energy in the environmental context, then it has been argued that it should firstly be electricity, as that is the form of energy that can meet most needs. And secondly, it should be sustainable because, well, obviously in the environmental context, that is very important. We must weigh up environmental and ecological needs, and that then happens through the framework of sustainability. That doesn't tell us, though, very much about the form of the right. And in the context of South Africa, and using a typology that was developed by Löfquist, I would suggest that it might be most useful not to think of it as a self-standing right or as a contractual right, but rather as a right that is derived from other rights, specifically derived from Section 24 of the Constitution. But the argument that I'm going to try and put forward is that a right to sustainable electricity that is read into the Section 24 of the Constitution might be quite well aligned to the concept of development and environment, as put forward by Professor Tracy Field, or social justice-oriented environmental law jurisprudence, as put forward by Dr. Murcott, who is, of course, in this very presentation. Now, moving on from that, I have said that I'm a sustainability scientist and a social scientist, and that led me to want to collect data as I was doing this project. There's something called Lisa Webley, who writes about empirical research in the legal context, and actually argues that whenever lawyers consider case law, we are in fact collecting data, and that's the way the thinking that I use to frame my consideration of jurisprudence. But I wanted to go a little bit further than that, and so I also conducted focus groups and did interviews with people that were working in and around Creel and on issues of energy in that area. Just to summarize, I did interviews and did focus groups with NGOs working on Creel, CBOs in Creel itself, and also participants in the high air political case, Deathly Air, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. Deadly Air, actually, I think it's called. In any case, so that's a very brief summary of my methodology. So the first thing that I did, as I just said, was to go into the jurisprudence using the concepts of the right to energy, socio-economic rights, the environmental right, to kind of code essentially and pick up tendencies in the jurisprudence. this is going to be a real whistle-stop tour through these cases, because I'm sure you all know them much better than I do. But as I went through this jurisprudence, there were various things that I picked up and that actually have been picked up by other writers as well. The first is that I think there is a general failure to link cases to Section 24, even where it is relevant. Ferris, in particular, Loretta Ferris, wrote about the failure to do so in the cases of Inouye Transport Community and Petroprops versus Barlow. Those were both cases that dealt with environmentally sensitive areas. Transport was about a land claim, and Barlow was about a service station that was to be built on a wetland. And both of them spoke about both of them actually had very interesting and important findings, which showed the importance of the linkage between socioeconomic rights and environmental rights. But neither of them linked their findings to Section 24, and I think that was a missed opportunity. Then beyond that, I think that there is a specific failure to link socioeconomic issues to Section 24. That's something that's been picked up by several writers, particularly by Peterson, who made that point in the context of the Olivia Road case, the Tubelisha Holmes case, and the Mazibuko case. Those are cases about housing rights, as I'm sure you know, and also water rights, both things that are very much related to an environment that is not harmful to our health and well-being. Peterson made the point that there was a missed opportunity in the first two cases to consider the duty that the state has to create a sustainable urban environment, a healthy urban environment. And in the case of the third case, water is obviously very much connected to the ecology that surrounds us. Then the final point that I picked up, or that I sort of picked up as a challenge, was that there seems to be a preference in the courts to resolve environmental issues through administrative law. I mean, that's not wrong as such, and that's something that was written about by Dugard and Alcaro, but it does mean that there is a failure to develop the environmental jurisprudence as much as I personally would like. Two cases that are examples there would be Federation of Forest Stable Environment and then the Joseph case, were both resolved through administrative law rather than engaging in substantive law issues. Just keeping an eye on the time. Though, of course, I didn't only see problems in the jurisprudence. There were also a number of cases where the linkages between socioeconomic rights and environmental, socioeconomic rights and environmental rights were clearly identified. And some great examples there would be fuel retailers that I'm sure we all know, that we have heard about already, and which spoke specifically about sustainable development as a way to give context to Section 24. Then some recent cases, which were quite exciting, were the Tafumanei case, the WWF case, and the Bakkerstrom case, all of which specifically highlight the linkage between socioeconomic rights and environmental rights. So I think that my view is that the linkage is growing, is being increasingly recognized, that there is a space in the jurisprudential moment to acknowledge that linkage. And what I then wanted to do once I come to that conclusion was, that's the trend that I saw, was look at my specific case study. So I went to Creel. I didn't only do the research in Creel itself because of COVID-19 restrictions, but I did go to Creel itself, and I spoke to people there, people working on issues around Creel. And and there were a number of things I picked up. The first was in terms of the perceptions of living conditions in Creel. That first quote just demonstrates how much pollution there is around Creel. The second, I'm not going to go through this in so much detail because I'm conscious of time, but the second quote, and there were a lot of others like it, just demonstrated the acute awareness that people had of the impact on their health that power stations and mines had that was surrounding them. Moving on from there, another big issue around Creel is unemployment, and there's an interaction between the health issues in Creel and the unemployment that is experienced. In that quote, one of the participants, the focus group participants, was talking about how if your health is poor, you can't even get a job in a mine. So your health is poor because you're living in an area surrounded by mines and power stations, but then you also can't get a job for that reason. Yes, and then the final quote is just to point out that even though people are surrounded by industries that are designed to create energy, for the most part, while energy access is relatively available, shall we say, people cannot afford electricity for most of the things that they would need it for. And that, of course, leads to them needing to burn coal in their houses, which contributes to the health problems that they experience. That's just a picture that I took of Kriel, and I think you can see quite clearly that both of the power stations are right there, and that people are clearly burning coal or some kind of combustible fuel in their houses, leading to indoor air pollution. I think the poverty is also quite clear there. The other major trend that I picked up through my interviews and my focus groups was along the lines of study participants' perceptions of Section 24. There was a lot of talk of the need for a right to clean air, of health and well-being being part of Section 24. But then very interestingly, there was a lot of talk of its socio-economic character and the social services that people felt that they needed through Section 24. So the social issues that were part of an environment that is not harmful to your health and well-being. And that to me just showed the very, very close interlinkage between socioeconomic rights and environmental rights. One of the NGO employees that I interviewed, I think, put it very well when he said, there is always this confusion that people want to use Section 24 as blocking development rather than defining development. And I think that's a very important point. Sorry, I see Dr. Murcott.
Ruth. Yes, you need to start wrapping up.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Questions.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Thank you. In that case, let me just very quickly say, the study participants also made it very clear that that they were conscious of the issues that would be encompassed by a right to sustainable energy or electricity. So the issues related to not having electricity and therefore having to burn coal indoors, but then also, being surrounded by power production, not having access to it. There were mixed feelings about the role of the courts, because some study participants didn't believe that there's much power in the courts, while others did. Some bemoaned the fact that the courts tend to take procedural routes rather than engaging substantively with the law. But some saw litigation as a real rallying point and saw court victories as a way for people to feel empowered and to then come forward with the issues that they have. So where I would like to arrive with this is that I think the jurisprudence shows the socioeconomic rootedness of environmental rights and the link between environmental rights and service delivery. My study in Kriel demonstrates the overlap between a possible right to sustainable electricity and the needs that people have, as well, and it also showed the socioeconomic expectations of the right. So that particular character of the right, which I think is important. And I also think that the right to sustainable electricity as a concept can be useful in solving issues like those of Kriel, because it links to academic literature, which might provide useful and interesting ideas, such as energy justice or sustainability science. In addition, I think that court precedents that can be won, court victories and the precedents that result from that can be very useful, particularly if one takes a more dispute-oriented approach to rights-based litigation. So if one looks at the indirect effects as well as the direct effects. So then just very quickly in conclusion, I know that I'm speaking a lot of time. What this study led me to were the ideas that the environmental right is a potential socioeconomic resource. It may be useful to read a right to sustainable electricity into the environmental right, but then also perhaps more procedurally in terms of how I did my study. I really think that rights must fit both the jurisprudence and the people that they protect, and that rights-based empirical research can help make them fit in that way, help you build the puzzle, if you like. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Just another incredibly interesting presentation. I'm learning so much about applications of Section 24, which again is just in the world of constitutional environmental rights. is at the very peak of the summit. And so thank you so much. We thought we'd turn to a discussion now, and there have been questions posted in the chat room. Tafumanei, let's start with you if that's okay. There are some questions posted first from Maricélle about how to overcome fragmentation, from Dr. Murcott about how, what to do with hermeneutics in light of the elitism and colonialism that's baked into multilateral environmental agreements. And then I had a question about, well, just then what to do. Do we turn to domestic responses, international responses, neither, both, in light of what you've learned? So you get the first word here. Thank you. And Ruth, if you could release the screen if you haven't already. So thank you.
Oh, I have, sorry, not sure why it hasn't gone back.
Tafumanei, are you still with us?
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for the questions. My response to the questions that have been given at that, what Gadamer actually gives us through his hermeneutics is the science of dialogue. So I pointed that the issues of elitism, the issues of the politics around environmental governance comes from deep-seated prejudices and assumptions, and they are perpetuated somewhat through what I called methodological formalism. The method of gathering information about environmental challenges is now embedded in technology, and we leave out IDKs, indigenous knowledge systems. So when we get into dialogue, we don't get into dialogue sort of with our minds filled with prejudices, because one way or the other, prejudices are biases to our openness to the world. That's the paradigm of understanding that Gadamer provides, that prejudice are merely biases towards our openness to the world. Yes, we are aware of deep-seated economic interests, but when you get there, you don't really need to alienate yourself from what you know is happening behind, but you keep that in mind and you don't use that as room for contention, but you use that as room to widen your imagination of what can be. So Gadamer provides rules of dialogue that do not dislocate you from your viewpoint, but rather opens up avenues of understanding for you. Then the second point is there is a subject-object divide when it comes to multilateral environmental agreements. We consider ourselves as humans and studying the environment rather than us listening to the environment. So we try to talk about the environment rather than letting the thing itself talk to us. So if you go to indigenous knowledge systems, the nature itself communicates with people. There is that kind of sanctity that nature gives to a community or to a village. I gave an example that when there is mist in a mountain from where I come from, we say the mountain is angry, but scientifically there's an explanation for that. But we have formalized the scientific and forget that there's an indigenous way of actually interpreting this. So is it possible for us to listen to nature, to let nature speak to us? I think it's very possible. So basically that was the argument to say, can we sort of not allow our dislocation from nature itself, but let us be in the world. We are in nature, not like we are separate. Yes, this is the era of the Anthropocene, this is the era of human, but the human being find himself or herself thrown into the environment. So we then create that subject-object divide to say, yes, we are there. Therefore, we have to use the nature as an object of study. That's what Gadamer is saying no to that. So perhaps I can respond to that. The second one is widening the sources of knowledge. So Gadamer is saying method on its own is not the only way of gathering knowledge. Allow the spontaneity of things. So I would be happy if we could perhaps consider a localized sort of COPs, localized climate change conference, where we allow various ethnic groups to sort of act out or to speak out or you know, something that is indigenous, something that is localized, then we try to draw meaning from there, because this is something that cannot be packaged in technical language, but we can only understand it on our own localized zone. So those who are responsible for gathering the knowledge, especially for IPCC reports, should also consider fragmenting their methodology to say, when it comes to Africa, we approach this way. When we go to Asia, we approach it this way, rather than generalizing the methodology and assume that we are all going to get the same knowledge. That's my first response for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tafumanei. That was really interesting. It added a lot to your presentation. I see Mike's hand is raised, but before we get to Mike's comment, we can just give Maricélle an opportunity to respond to a couple of the questions that came in, and Mike, then we'll go to you straight after that. So I presume you've already had a look at them, Maricélle. I think they're mainly about the challenges of implementation and what do we do. But I'd like to add to that and ask the question, are the laws really that good if they're unimplementable? Can we say they're good when they're clearly not being used? Are they not then probably right for the people who are meant to be using them? But over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Mercott. Yes, that is a very important or very interesting point you raise. And I do agree that perhaps the law is a bit of a shortfall. I wouldn't necessarily say, for instance, it's the constitutional right to an environment or the environmental right that is lacking. But I do think that, and I had a similar question at the IUCN conference earlier in July or June. And I think that there is space for legislation to be adapted, to be more implementable at the local level. And I think we see a big discrepancy between metropolitan cities or municipalities and how they are implementing or using several instruments to address ecosystem services. But I also think that we don't really see that as much in the district or local municipalities, for example. And I do feel like perhaps there is place for the law to be adapted to speak specifically to the different types of municipalities that we have. So I do think that there might be room for improvement in the legislation itself, but not necessarily in the environmental rights. And that kind of, all my answers kind of link to one another. So I'll just start with the questions of how do we get municipalities to use the legal instruments available to them more effectively. And I think related to my previous answer about the legislation being adapted, in addition to that, I think that knowledge and capacity building for municipalities, especially the district or local municipalities that are undergoing a lot of urbanization, I think that's important. And also inputs and assistance from national and provincial governance is also very important, because sometimes municipalities, as stated, do not have the capacity or the necessary skills or knowledge to implement different instruments or alternative instruments, or even a combination of instruments. They might only know about bylaws, for example. So I think that the national and provincial government's inputs and assistance can greatly help municipalities. And that links me to a question I think Johandri asked about the enacting of framework bylaws. And NEMA and the CMAs, as well as the Municipal Systems Act, actually makes provision for the creation or drafting of framework bylaws that municipalities are supposed to be able to use and adapt to their specific circumstances. But to date, there aren't many bylaws like that, and those that we do have are not utilized and they're outdated. And I don't think municipalities at this point have the necessary legal skills or capacity to effectively implement or adapt these framework bylaws that currently not many of exist, but they don't actually have the legal skills and stuff to create the law necessary or the bylaws necessary for protecting ecosystem services, for example. And that's something that partially my PhD might actually look at. So on the implementation or the reasons for non-implementation other than capacity challenges, I think a few came to mind. And again, it's the limited skill or knowledge on the different bylaws, I think, and also short-term planning and the fact that many municipal departments have shifts in who's responsible for what. So sometimes you'd have an advocate for environmental protection or ecosystem services protection, but their duration in the municipal offices are too short. So the short-term planning or the long-term planning doesn't get affected. And I think that's where the environmental issues are addressed in the long-term planning. And as soon as new municipal managers or people responsible for the environment in cities or environmental protection in cities come into play, their political agenda or their short-term plans or other plans differ from that of the previous management. And I also think that the environment is kind of up against social and economic challenges that is very rampant in South Africa. I mean, everyone knows that South Africa is struggling with job loss and unemployment and poverty, and people that live in informal settlements, for example, that don't have access to basic services. So I think the environment is kind of facing off against these. And I don't think that there's enough political buy-in. There's no political drive to actually implement these instruments because municipalities have to deal with service delivery. They have to look at social economic rights. So I think the environment kind of takes the back seat in that regard. And then Johan also asked.
I think we might have to wrap it up there, just to give the other speakers a chance to answer questions. But feel free. That was a great response. I think there's so much to say. Feel free to add more in the comments.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and that was just super interesting too, and it raises the question as to what the framers of Section 24 had in mind with regard to ecologically sustainable development, ecosystem protection at the municipal level. Be curious if you have any more thoughts about that in the chat room. So for Rufaro's talk next on speaking of ecologically sustainable development and really the way the provisions are written and the thoughts about that. Michael, are you still with us? Michael Kidd, Professor Kidd?
Yes, I'm here. Just trying to.
Your hand was up,
yeah,
so
there we go.
Hey, Michael, I don't know if your question was about this, so I thought maybe if it is, you could ask it. Thank you.
Yeah, I know that time's short. I've actually got 3 comments / questions for 3 different speakers, and I'll try and be as quick as possible. Firstly, in relation to Maricélle, well, firstly, let me just say that the session was excellent, and I think all 4 presentations were really good. So congratulations on the speakers. And I think congratulations also to the people that have been assisting the speakers, i.e. the supervisors. I think they're often forgotten. So Maricélle, I just wanted to know, you might have mentioned it, but I might have missed it, whether you have thought about environmental management frameworks as well as something that can work in the context of the objectives that you're seeking to meet. As far as Rufaro is concerned, I think people would expect that I'd have some kind of response to her presentation. One of my students actually a few years ago wrote his LLM dissertation, for which he got a first, essentially completely disagreeing with me on my take on Section 24B3. Firstly, let me say that I would really eat my hat if the drafters of Section 24B3 thought that it would be interpreted in the way that Refaro is suggesting. But that's irrelevant in any event, because the intention of the legislature is not a big deal in terms of interpretation. It's looking at the overall context and what the wording actually says. I think it would be great if what Refaro is suggesting was the way in which Section 24 was interpreted. But I think if you look at many of the decisions, and I'm not really talking here about the court decisions, but the decisions of the administrators, the people who are making decisions on environmental authorizations, I think in many cases it would be nice if they actually gave some consideration to the word sustainable, let alone the word ecologically. That's just a very quick comment on that. And then finally, in relation to Ruth's talk, I mean, just about everything that you said there, I felt that there was something that I could respond to, not in the sense that I disagreed with you, but I thought, you know, that's a good point, but have you thought about this? So I don't on Tracy's toes, but it might be quite nice to talk about some of the issues in that presentation. I mean, I thought it was an excellent talk and an excellent idea. Just in relation to the linkages between socio-economic rights and Section 24, in addition to what you dealt with there, I mean, one of the things that's occurred to me is that even though Section 24 is not really a socio-economic right itself, and it doesn't have any internal modifier in relation to progressive realization, it has to be realized progressively, because there are so many people who are living in an environment that is not conducive to health or well-being, or that is harmful to health or well-being. And it's not possible simply to change the situation like that. There's got to be some progressive steps and a plan as per Grootboom as to how to address that issue. So people who are living in polluted environments, we can't just say, well, let's switch the electricity off and let's close down Creel, because it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen overnight. But it all ties in with this notion of a just transition and climate change and so on and so forth. I suppose, along with everybody here and numerous other people, are still waiting for that plan. Where's the plan that we need urgently in relation to phasing out coal and moving over to other forms of energy provision, taking into account that we need to provide energy to people as well, as you argued. So hopefully I didn't take up too much time there.
Michael, thank you. That was a terrific insight and additional questions about Section 24 and its application. Refaro, let's begin with any responses you have to that or to the questions in the chat room, and then we'll turn it over to you, Ruth. If you could each just limit your responses, sorry, to just about a minute and a half. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, Professor Kidd is very right. Environmental authorities have really been neglecting to interpret or to base their decisions on ecologically sustainable development. And with regards to courts, they have been basing their decisions based on sustainable development. But what does the Constitution say? The Constitution expressly provides for ecologically sustainable development, which must count for something. That adjective, like I've said, must count for something. The problem is that between the ordinary sustainable development and ecologically sustainable development, sustainable development is way more popular, and ecologically sustainable development is being misconstrued is the ordinary sustainable development. Well, I guess that is why our courts have not yet really given content to ecologically sustainable development. I would have loved to say more on that, but because of time, I will proceed to the next comment on Bosselman's work. Yes, indeed, Bosselman does say that development must be based on ecologically sustainable development so that it meets the needs of people living today and in the future. In my understanding, what Bosselman is trying to say is that although social and economic development are necessary for human survival, they are not to be given primacy. Social and economic development ought to be subject to and promote environmental protection. For instance, in pursuing economic growth, it would be fruitless to engage in unsustainable development activities that overexploit the natural resource base because such exploitation could leave future generations without any resources to live by, thereby leading to things such as poverty. So ecologically sustainable development is really not against development, but it is against unsustainable development. Well, I guess that is why maybe courts choose to rely on sustainable development, because it could be that there is an argument that ecologically sustainable development negates social and economic development, but actually it doesn't. It only says that economic and social development must be subject to environmental protection. That way, the environmental right, especially the right to have the environment protected, can be realized. I'm not sure.
We'll have to, Rufaro, thank you. We'll have to leave it at that. That's a great point to leave it on.
Okay, thank you.
And Ruth, you get the final word here for responses to questions and comments. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'll try to keep it very, very short. I saw some questions in the chat box, and just in response to those. First of all, I didn't consider foreign law very much. I must admit, to my knowledge, there is no right to energy as such in any constitution anywhere in the world, to my knowledge. And there's very little recognition of it in the law, although, as I think I mentioned in the presentation, there is a form of recognition of it both in the UK and in France. So it's slowly gaining traction, but that's definitely something that I should look at further. There was also a question about whether why I was focused on electricity rather than energy. And of course, one needs to see energy very broadly, but one of the writers that I looked at, whose name now suddenly tells me, but electricity is the form of energy that tends to be applicable to most needs, and is also, because of its centralized nature, possibly the form of energy that is easiest to make sustainable quickly. That is why I was focusing. That is why I was focusing on it. Also because in the South African context, and I think in the context of many global South countries, the choices between electricity and combustible fuel, burning combustible fuel for energy, creates sort of indoor air pollution, and that is one of the considerations that I really wanted to highlight. One of the things that I continue to move away from and need to consider within the context of environmental rights. In response to another question, and also in response to Professor Kidd, I quite agree that that the environmental rights needs to be seen progressively. I don't agree with the stance that I think is currently being taken in the deadly air case. I don't know whether you've been following that, but that's a really interesting case centering around Mpumalanga, and that seeks to see environmental rights as unqualified, in contrast to how socio-economic rights are seen. And I completely agree that if we are reading socio-economic rights into environmental rights, I think we need to, then one has to acknowledge their progressive nature. But nevertheless, I think it's very useful to focus on to change the narrative slightly, I suppose, to focus on a form of development that is important but must exist within the boundaries of what is ecologically possible. I think that focusing on socio-economic rights is also a way to demonstrate the importance of environmental rights, to demonstrate the interlinkage between our social needs and the environment that surrounds us. I had
so
more
much.
to say, but I know that thank you very much.
I think what is hopefully going to come out of deadly air, if nothing else, is that a right to an environment not harmful to health and well-being cannot mean one where thousands of people die every year from deadly air, literally deadly air. So let's hope that that comes out of the case, if nothing else. There were some brilliant reactions to the comments and questions, and hopefully all the speakers have taken on board the questions, especially those of you whose research is ongoing. But for Ruth, who's completed her research, it's definitely worth engaging further with Prof. Kidd and with the questions you've been asked, and publishing your paper. It's important, especially given the interdisciplinarity of it. It's over now to close the session. Thank you for hanging in there with us, those of you who stayed. As you know, hopefully, as all the presenters know, there's a Best Presenter prize that we'll be handing out in the closing session, and as well as a Best Essay prize that we'll be handing out. And those prizes are with huge thanks to our sponsors, Juta, and we're very grateful for them. The students, I'm sure, who win the prize will be very grateful as well. And Juta's also got a whole range of brilliant books, including, of course, my kid's book on environmental law. And so with that, we'll say thank you to all of you. It's been a real pleasure. And we hope to see you in the rest of the conference if you're available. And yeah, have a good evening. Thanks all. Bye-bye. Oh, and I think they wanted a photo. If everyone is willing to turn on their cameras, we can take a quick screenshot of the session. Whoever's got the bandwidth, and we'll also put it up on social media. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Wait for a couple more cameras.
Thanks, everyone. That was a real treat. Congratulations on all of your work and on the 25th anniversary of environmental rights leading light, constitutionally speaking.
Great. I got some pics. And thank you all, and see you in the next session tomorrow morning. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.